Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is Eisenherz and today I want to talk about an archetype that a lot of people assume does not exist in cEDH. Let's talk about control. But before we start, let me give a quick shout out to TK from Playing with Power, who recently made a very insightful Twitter post about control in cEDH and inspired me to make this video. The link to said post can be found in the description box down below, so without further ado, let's get started. In regular 1v1 Magic, there are generally three archetypes decks fall into: aggro, midrange and control. And they relate to each other in a kind of rock, paper, scissors way, where aggro overruns midrange, midrange outvalues control, and control suffocates aggro. Of course, this is oversimplified and there are more subtypes of decks like tempo and combo, but generally speaking, this triangle of archetypes applies to 1v1 formats in MTG. In cEDH, however, as a multiplayer free-for-all format, the archetypes are a bit different. On one hand, aggro is replaced by turbo decks that seek to assemble a game-ending combo as fast as possible, because it is much easier to resolve a turn 3 ad nauseam that draws you into your combo pieces than it is to deal 120 damage to the whole pot. On the other hand, control decks are replaced by Stax decks that seek to prohibit your opponents from taking game actions, eventually lock down the board and win via combat damage or some combo. The archetype triangle for cEDH would therefore look something like this. Turbo decks overwhelm midrange decks outvalue Stax decks, and Stax decks hate on turbo decks. Again, this is kind of oversimplified, but in general it applies to most decks. But is there really no place for control decks in cEDH? Well, there definitely is, but in order to understand their place in cEDH, we need to A. understand the differences between control in 1v1 and control in multiplayer, and B, we need to understand the differences between control and stacks. So let's get into some details. In 1v1, you're obviously only facing one opponent, which means that in theory you can trade your spells versus their spells one for one. So for example, if they cast a Ragavan, you can react to it with a mental misstep and both of you are down one card. But of course, you have just denied them a very impactful card. As both of you draw one card per turn, the cycle can continue until one of you runs out of gas and the other can present a threat that will eventually take over the game. In a multiplayer format, this approach of trading cards one for one is not possible, at least for one player alone, because you only have 7 cards in hand and draw 1 card per turn cycle, while your opponents altogether have 21 cards in hand and draw 3 cards per turn cycle. So they have a 3-to-1 card advantage, which means that in order to control the board like you would in a 1v1 game, every piece of interaction you have would have to counter 3 of your opponent's spells, or every turn cycle you'd need to draw 3 cards in order to keep up the pace, while also generating enough mana to cast interaction after interaction. Realistically, that's not possible, so control has to play differently in a multiplayer free-for-all format. First of all, you need a highly meta and pot-adaptive suite of interaction, and in order to use that interaction, you need a steady stream of cards coming in, so some kind of card draw engine is absolutely necessary to keep up the pace. Furthermore, you need to be very decisive about which spells to counter and which not. This can be extremely hard because you need extensive meta knowledge to understand which cards can potentially be a threat in a longer game. Additionally, you need to make decisions on which counterspells to use at what moment. Do you use the Spell Snare now, or is it better to use the Stern Scolding? These are questions you constantly have to ask yourself in order to draw the most value out of each and every counterspell you have. Furthermore, adaptive control decks in cEDH have to play hate pieces because these allow you to control multiple game actions over multiple turns without casting multiple spells. A prime example would be Counterbalance. For an investment of 2 mana, you can counter multiple spells over multiple turns. Pair that with Sensei's Divining Top, and you have yourself a control engine most people won't get through. Other hate pieces slow down your opponent's strategies and put some obstacles in their way, like Opposition Agent, Trinisphere, Orcish Bowmasters, or Narset Part of Veils. So in that sense, a control deck in cEDH has to be both reactive by having an array of stack interaction and removal, but also proactive by having specific hate pieces that slow down the opposing strategies. But how does control differentiate itself from stacks if both strategies play hate or stacks pieces? First of all, stacks and hate pieces are proactive in nature. You actively put pieces into play that say that your opponents can't take certain game actions. Prime examples would be Rule of Law, Collector Oath, Null Rod or Curse Totem. A common trait of these Stax pieces is that they say something in the lines of can't do XYZ, so they prohibit some game actions altogether. Control, on the other hand, is more reactive. Control spells or permanents generally don't state that a certain game action can't be taken at all, but that it is either harder to take that action or that a certain action is being denied selectively. Control pieces therefore don't deny all game actions but interact with certain game actions. Prime examples for control spells would be any kind of counterspell, and to a degree even removal spells, and cards like Counterbalance, which is a permanent, but it doesn't deny all game actions. Rather, interacts with selective game actions, especially if you can manipulate your top deck. Additionally, dedicated Stax decks want to prolong the game as much as possible. The more they can layer Stax pieces and lock the board, the better their position to win the game becomes. They generally aim to win in the late game. Control decks don't generally want to prolong the game as much as possible by layering hate pieces on top of hate pieces. The idea of a control deck is to interact with certain game actions so that your opponents can't present an undisrupted win when they ideally would, which will eventually allow you to present a win when no interaction is left in the pot. For most control decks, this window only opens up after 1 to 2 failed opposing win attempts, which often is also in the late game. But an adaptive control deck can also present wins in the mid game. The idea is that an adaptive control deck might not be the fastest or grindiest or the deck with the hardest lock, but it can in theory present a win at different points of the game, ideally after closing opponents' windows of opportunity and opening up their own windows of opportunity. So what can we learn from that about control in cEDH? Well, first and foremost, control is reactive, unlike Stax. This means that our choices of interaction and hate pieces are extremely meta and pot dependent. Control has to adapt to its environment. Unlike a dedicated Stax deck, you can't just drop Stax piece after Stax piece and be done with it. Every single piece of interaction you use matters, and you have to be able to decide on A, which spells to mulligan or tutor for, B, which spells to interact with, and C, which interaction spells to use at which point. This leads to an endless number of decision points that make control extremely hard to pilot successfully. Additionally, you need to continuously draw or recycle cards so that you don't run out of resources. Think back to the difference of control in 1v1 and control in multiplayer. We can't trade spells into interaction 1 for 1, because in total our opponents have 3 times the cards we have. So in order to efficiently control what they do, we need to be very thoughtful of what cards to interact with, and we need to constantly refuel our hand so we can handle multiple win attempts from different players. Of course, we shouldn't be alone in doing that and can't police the table single-handedly, but we need to at least be able to make it harder for opponents to present their winning lines in order to close down their windows of opportunity. This constant need to be able to react to some degree also means that a control deck has to prioritize card quality and minimize slots for dead cards or combo pieces. Especially in the early stages of the game, or when your opponent would have their window of opportunity to win the game, you do not want to draw into a combo piece that will just sit in your hand doing nothing for at least a few turns. And although an adaptive control list is theoretically able to present a win at any stage of the game, after opening up a window by disrupting an opponent's win attempt, it is much more likely to win in the late game after your opponents have already had unsuccessful win attempts. This also leads to one of the biggest issues control decks have, at least in tournament EDH, the time limit. While it is definitely possible to win in the early or mid game, it is much more likely that you will present a win in the late game, so turn 6 and later, which can actually be hard to reach when rounds are limited to 75 minutes. So it is crucial for a control player to think fast, act fast and call their opponents out for slow play, just so the game can actually reach turn 6, 7 or 8. Yet another factor that makes control incredibly hard in cEDH. To summarize, adaptive control decks are hard to brew and even harder to pilot. Decision points are endless and extensive meta and deck knowledge is necessary to perform well. These decks need a strong arsenal of stack interaction and hate pieces, as well as draw engines to constantly refuel. An adaptive control deck can win early, but is never the fastest in the pot. It can grind value, but not as efficiently as a pure mid-range deck could. And it can control the board, but not lock it in a way that a Stax deck would. Its goal is to close the opponent's windows as much as possible in order to open up its own windows to combo off. It can win at any point of the game, but does so much more reliably in the mid to late game. A common example for an adaptive control deck that is often mislabeled as a Stax deck would be Urza, which is the deck I'm most known for. It's my absolute favorite deck and definitely one that aims to win in the later part of the game. It also has more hate pieces because Urza is able to abuse them in a very unique way by shutting them off when needed. Another deck that is seeing more play recently is Nimrist, which is a Dimir control deck that has a commander with built-in card advantage. It is a bit costly, but having access to Thassa's Oracle and Memebet more than makes up for it. And a very new example for an adaptive control deck would be Talion, which is also a Dimir commander that can potentially draw a ton of cards. The final example for a control deck is Tasigur. Tasigur also has a way to generate card advantage and reuse interaction at any point, which allows it to efficiently control the board. Add the fact that Tasigur can be neoformed into bombs like Toxrill, Koma, Nezahal or Hullbreaker Horror, and you have yourself a solid adaptive control list. And that's it. What do you think about adaptive mid-range control in cEDH? Is it an archetype you'd consider playing? Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. If you enjoy my content and want to support me, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, hop over to my Discord server and please consider becoming a patron. I have different tiers set up so there is something for everyone. And I also provide one-on-one coaching and brewing support for those of you that want to bring their piloting to the next level. This is Eisenherz and Auf Wiedersehen.